Opening the center with this pawn immediately contests central squares and prepares development. Developing the knight to f6 immediately stakes a claim in the center and prepares for e5 or d5, offering flexible pawn structure options. Asserting central space, this advance immediately challenges black's knight and aims for queenside dominance. Preparing to fianchetto, this develops the bishop to a long-range diagonal, eyeing the center and preparing for kingside castling. Establishing kingside fianchetto, aiming for queenside expansion later. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for bg, aims for a robust fianchetto setup. Solidifying the fianchetto, this bishop prepares to exert influence across the long diagonal, aiming to pin down potential black pieces. Challenging the center, black initiates a dynamic pawn struggle and aims to seize initiative. Opening the center this way releases positional pressure, granting both sides active piece play and immediate tactical possibilities. Reclaiming the central pawn opens up attacking diagonals for the bishop and allows for more active piece development. Securing the center with knight development reinforces white's pawn presence and prepares for further piece coordination. Solidifying the fianchetto, black prepares to pressure the center and develop the queenside. Chasing black's knight to the edge creates a peculiar island for your own knight, a quiet ambition to control the f4 square, yet it neglects immediate central pressure. Sacrificing a key defender opens the bishop's diagonal, potentially unleashing a furious kingside assault. Trading the dark-squared bishop on h3 eliminates a key defender of black's kingside, potentially weakening its structure for future attacks. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies control over central squares and prepares for future pawn pushes, subtly preparing a central fight. Recapturing the bishop reestablishes central pawn presence and prepares to contest the light-squared diagonal. Developing the kingside pawn chain now solidifies the central structure and prepares for queenside expansion. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for potential kingside expansion, this move emphasizes long-term positional advantage. Securing the king's safety is paramount. Now black can focus on developing pieces and contesting the center. Developing the bishop to activate its diagonal and prepare for pawn advances on the queenside offers a solid positional approach. Focusing the rook on the open c-file directly challenges white's pawn structure and prepares for potential queenside activity. Securing the king's sanctuary amidst the developing central storm, this action offers immediate safety and prepares for potential pawn pushes. A flexible repositioning, aiming to bring the knight to a more active central square and support potential pawn breaks. Initiating a slow, positional march for the knight, aiming to redeploy it to a more influential square later. Introducing pressure on the queenside, this maneuver prepares to exploit the open c-file while potentially creating tactical opportunities. Centralizing the bishop reinforces the queenside pressure and prepares for future pawn advances. Developing the rook to the d-file prepares for potential pressure and supports the central pawn structure. Shifting the knight to the queenside creates potential pressure on black's pawn structure and prepares for future queenside expansion. Reclaiming central influence, this knight's repositioning offers a subtle but potent redirection, aiming to bolster the d-pawn and activate the queen's diagonal. Asserting queenside influence, this queen redeployment pressures black's central pawn structure and seeks to exploit potential weaknesses. Injecting activity and contesting the center, this knight finds a more active square and prepares for potential pawn breaks, adding dynamic tension to black's position. Simplifying to a potentially favorable endgame, white surrenders queens and opens lines for future piece play. Reclaiming the captured pawn, black solidifies their central presence while activating the queen's rook along the open file, setting up potential queenside pressure. Reclaiming the bishop's central influence, white aims to bolster the kingside pawn structure and prepare for the inevitable queenside expansion. Asserting influence on the queenside with the knight, potentially eyeing the weak c3 pawn. Repositioning the knight to d3, White eyes the c5 square and prepares to challenge black's queenside pressure. Shifting the bishop to a more passive square, potentially aiming to support a later pawn push or reroute to a different wing. Seeking to dislodge the knight and gain a vital outpost on e5, this pawn push prepares a potential kingside pawn storm. A daring knight repositioning that aims to disrupt white's central control and potentially exploit the light squares. Solidifying the bishop's long-term placement, this maneuver subtly reins in black's queenside expansion. Activating the bishop along the long diagonal, preparing for potential piece exchanges and improving bishop's scope. Securing the c-file immediately establishes crucial control for future operations. Seizing an outpost, black prepares to activate the knight and challenge white's central control. Reinforcing the central pawns prepares for pawn pushes and a potential kingside attack. Shifting the knight to the flank aims to pressure white's queenside pawns and potentially control the a-file. Unlocking the central files for potential breakthroughs, this king repositioning prepares for active play while shoring up the kingside. Refocusing the dark-squared bishop to its excellent diagonal strengthens the kingside pawn structure and prepares for potential piece maneuvering. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to generate space and restrict black's pieces. Consolidating the knight's influence on the kingside pawns, now eyeing the queenside majority. Reinforcing the queenside pawn structure, this move aims to solidify white's positional advantage and prepare for a potential kingside advance. Pivoting the knight to contest the open b-file, aiming for positional disruption. Securing the king's safety in this open position becomes paramount, offering a bit more breathing room. Shifting the bishop back to f8 is a pragmatic attempt to regroup defensively, though it surrenders the active bishop pair and concedes central influence. Challenging black's queenside pawn structure, this pawn push aims to disrupt their coordination and potentially win material. The knight scurries to a new outpost, eyeing the queenside and preparing to support a pawn push. Reinforcing the knight's central presence, the bishop repositions to support potential kingside advances. Pushing the knight to its edge, black prepares to contest the queenside's open files and potentially restrict white's central pawn push. Repositioning the bishop to the f1 square aims to untangle white's pieces and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the kingside. Bolstering the kingside pawn structure to prevent white's pieces from infiltrating the e6 square is a sensible defensive measure. Solidifying the e3 pawn's defense, this redeployment seeks to bolster the central structure and prepare for future pawn pushes. Reactivating the knight to the queenside now threatens to exploit the open file and create counterplay. Opening the c-file now offers white a chance to centralize the rook and pressure black's queenside majority. Recapturing the rook on the open c-file reestablishes vital central control and prevents white from easily infiltrating. Reasserting control over the central file, white aims to consolidate and prepare for potential advances. A daring recapture, immediately intensifying the battle for the open central file and creating chances for counterplay. Repositioning the knight to c1 shores up weak squares and prepares for a slow pawn push. A bold foray to activate the bishop, aiming to disrupt white's consolidated pawn structure. King centralization finally begins, seeking activity after a drawn-out maneuver. Capturing the knight opens up the file for white's rook and improves black's bishop placement. King centralization is now paramount for white to exploit the open central files and potential pawn weaknesses. Liberating the knight for a sharp tactical sequence, seizing material with immediate effect. The king ventures out, aiming to reclaim the initiative and secure central influence before black's pawns advance too aggressively. A desperate attempt to reignite pressure on the queenside, but the pawn will be hard-pressed to survive this endgame's open nature. This king march is a proactive step to solidify the pawn structure before the endgame truly takes hold. A king's journey begins, seeking safer pastures away from the central contention. Opening this e-pawn seizes central space, challenging the knight's blockade and aiming to activate the bishop. A desperate attempt to disrupt white's pawn center, though it may expose the king to further attack. Opening the g-file creates immediate complications for the black king's sanctuary. Opening the king's file leads to an immediate tactical reckoning for the black monarch. Stabilizing the bishop offers a solid defensive square and prepares to challenge black's central pawn structure. Shifting the king towards the center now is a pragmatic decision, aiming to activate it for the ensuing pawn exchanges and potential endgame. Solidifying the bishop's central outpost, this maneuver prepares to exploit the weakened kingside. King activity is paramount now. The knight must find a more active square than this passive outpost. Liberating the queen-bishop allows it to eye crucial squares on the queenside. A crucial step to reposition the king for better defensive and potential offensive coordination. Rerouting the bishop to a more active diagonal now that the knight has been chased away. Embracing the challenge, this capture forces white to confront the newly opened e-file and its potential for black's pawns. Capturing the pawn opens the e-file, inviting a decisive kingside offensive. Slowing the pawn storm's momentum, this pawn retreat shores up the kingside and prepares for potential counterplay. Re-establishing the bishop's dominance on the long diagonal offers increased attacking potential. Pushing forward with the h-pawn here aims to create a passed pawn, but it weakens the kingside structure significantly. Liberating the d-file opens lines for the queen and rook, a timely shift to aggressive intent. Reclaiming central space with the pawn opens up the game for the black king. Securing the king's flank by creating an escape route in this pawn-heavy endgame. Repositioning the knight to a more active square, aiming to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially create counterplay on the queen side. Unleashing a discovered attack that forces a king into a perilous central position. Shifting the king to a more active square, preparing for potential kingside action and central pawn pushes. Unleashing the bishop here initiates a crucial pawn dissection, aiming to crack open the black position. The knight seeks a more active outpost, aiming to challenge white's central pawns from a new angle. Anchoring the bishop here eyes the pawn chain and prepares to support a central breakthrough. Reclaiming the queenside outpost is the immediate goal, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure. Reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing to advance the knight toward the kingside. Opening up the bishop's diagonal to potentially activate the knight on c6 is a promising idea. Fortifying the bishop's post is crucial for controlling the central diagonal and supporting the upcoming pawn advances. Consolidating the king's position is paramount, creating a safe haven amidst the pawn storm. Unleashing a discovered check, the bishop forces a king repositioning, potentially opening pathways for white's pawns. Seeking to consolidate his king's safety while probing for any weaknesses in white's pawn structure, this move prepares for a potential regrouping. Gaining an open diagonal for the bishop, aiming to harass the black king's defenses. Seeking to improve king's safety, black repositions his monarch to a slightly more sheltered square. Reinforcing the center's pawn structure with the bishop now offers flexibility for the knight and better control of the d4 square. Re-establishing knight mobility is key, aiming to contest the critical central squares and create dynamic counterplay. Unleashing the bishop here aims to exploit the pawn structure's weaknesses and restrict black's knight.